Now, first what we have to discuss is, of course, a matter of principles. We live in a democratic society, so this is absolutely crucial. The principles according to which we live within a democratic society are supposed to entail that the right to fail, so to speak. This is to say, essentially, that the reason why people smoke cigarettes, the reason why people drink alcohol, the reason why people climb mountains and participate in extreme sports and things of all that nature, is because they understand what one philosopher, a great philosopher who was unfortunately somewhat underrated, named Lev Shestov, said. And that is to say that we've been conditioned to regard health and to regard a particular ideal of health, a particular standard of health put in place by a power structure, essentially. We've been conditioned to regard that as important. And we rarely actually acknowledge that this is rather arbitrary, that we're being one-sided, in a sense, when we try to repress illness, when we try to repress our natural human dignity, which doesn't only involve life, but also involves death. And that, as was wisely put by Isaac Brock of Modest Mouse, we can run the risk of, so to speak, going sick worrying about our health. What people don't recognize is that this is called utilitarianism. This is called the greatest good for the greatest number. But simply put, there is no way of really knowing what the greatest good for the greatest number is. You've got the DSM, the manual, which was put in place by big pharmaceutical companies, more or less cannibalizing really the really uninteresting psychoanalytic theory from the 20th century. And basically, this becomes our standard for health. I mean, think of the Nazis and how their standard for health was basically someone with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the lengths to which they were willing to go to attain that standard of health. Well, in a sense, that may seem like an extreme, that may seem like, you shouldn't use the Nazis as an example. But fundamentally, it's all the same principle. Michel Foucault, the bald French guy from the late 20th century, the philosopher, basically rebelled against the norms of his time by volitionally contracting AIDS and actually spreading it to people. And he apparently had a long treatise explaining why he did this. But his whole principle was that most of our ideals of what good health is were the result of power structures. They were entirely socially conditioned. And they were not actually necessary a priori. And while he might have gone to an extreme, perhaps the opposite extreme of the extreme that the Nazis went to, we have to understand that the greatest good for the greatest number comes at a considerable price, not only to the minority but also to the mass, because through mass-mindedness, through mass media, mass communication, we end up getting stuck with a kind of subpar existence. And I know this is all ambiguous, I'll get to the real details later. We end up getting stuck buying a lot of things that we don't need, praising a sort of sense of choice that we have, even if it's between variables that totally don't matter. And we fall into meaninglessness, we fall into depression. And of course, these major players in the game, these media outlets, these pharmaceutical companies, these legal structures will always exploit that sort of depression. You're being depressed? Here, have a pill for it. Here, take your rage out on some celebrity, or something of that nature. And this is a problem with our current spirit of the times, that we lose our sense of individual dignity in subservience to the mass, what the mass considers good. And as I will be addressing in the third part of this video, what the mass considers good might not even be what most people consider good, but it is what is given the most circulation, and therefore appears to be what the collective consciousness and collective unconscious believes, but it's actually a series of mimetic diseases. So, the question is therefore that of health. Is it up to the mass to decide what health is, or is it up to the individual? And how does this relate to immunity? Well, obviously, if I choose not to smoke, because that's not my ideal of health, and I choose instead to take, I choose instead to drink yogurt and expose my body to all these probiotics. Or, supposing I choose antibiotics, supposing that that's my ideal of health. Well, I'll never know which of these two ideals is the right ideal, which is the right way of living. I mean, you could live for a very long time and live very miserably. You can choose that. And fundamentally, no one really knows what it is that kills us, because not one of us has come back from the dead to tell us this. Sure, we lend this authority to scientists, or we lend this authority to religious figures, but the moment we stop lending authority to people, the moment we grow up, so to speak, and take responsibility for our own experiences, we have to admit we don't know. I mean, someone looking through a microscope and discerning a few microbes, if he or she is sufficiently clever, as was sufficiently clever to pass the exit exams at a university, might say, oh, that over there, that looks like Ebola, or that looks like a paramecium, or that looks like the HIV. But fundamentally, it's anyone's guess what is really going on within our organisms, physically and maybe non-physically. Because the human intellect, while it likes order, or it's at least conditioned to enjoy order, to map things out, is oftentimes wrong. When we're brought up in our chemistry classes, we're shown a series of reactions, and you might see a magnesium explosion, and one person might describe it as being a bright white light, another person might describe it as a bright blue light. But because of the way that our school system is structured all the way through university, at least if you're going into the scientific field, it's presumed that there's one right answer, and you were supposed to have found it in the book itself, and to have applied it, therefore, to what you've seen. And to the degree that you agree, to that degree you're right. And you get an A. To the degree that you disagree, to that degree you're shamed. And even if you manage to make it through college, and then go off on your own path, say, like Rupert Sheldrake did, you'll be shamed after the fact, no matter what. If you disagree with, well, whatever makes people feel comfortable at that stage in history. And this has been the case throughout religious history, throughout social history, pretty much as far back as any educated person would see anthropologically. But fundamentally, like I said, it's anyone's guess what's going on in your own organism. William James proved this through the theory of confirmation bias. Karl Popper made this pretty much a credo within the scientific community through falsifiability, that we never actually have objective knowledge. And I'm reminded also of this parable from the Taoists about the Taoist farmer. The Taoist farmer has a son, you see, and he also has a horse, and one day the horse runs away. These are pretty much the only two things he has. He really appreciates his own poverty. He's a Taoist. And the horse runs away, and the people in the village say, oh, that's terrible. And the Taoist farmer says, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. The following day the horse comes back, and he's accompanied by some wild horses, and the people of the village say, oh, that's wonderful. And he says, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. The following day the Taoist farmer's son is trying to train these horses, and the the people of the village notice that the son falls off the horse and breaks his leg, and they say it's terrible. And the farmer says, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. The following day, the conscription officers come by, and they can't take the son because the son has a broken leg. And the people of the village say, oh no, that's wonderful. And the farmer says, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, said of Americans that we're very utilitarian. We always try to make the ends justify the means. We'll use any means to get to the right end. But the thing is, once we get there, as Alan Watts pointed out, we're oftentimes not happy. We don't really know what we want, but we think that we do. And we always think it's in the future. But when we arrive there and that becomes the present, at that point, it's a little more ambiguous whether or not it was even worth it. I'm sure many of us have had this experience. So I think that really, in terms of health, you should adopt the attitude of the Taoist farmer, saying we do not know what health is. And at any rate, we don't have the right to impose that upon anyone.